When we talk about marking gauges, there are a couple questions that always seem to crop up. One is, what's the difference between using a traditional marking gauge with a sharp pin that marks the workpiece versus one with a cutting edge like this more modern wheel marking gauge, or this homemade marking gauge I made with a blade that has a bevel on either end that I can use to mark the workpiece? Well, I want to show you the differences and talk about why you would choose one over the other one. Let's talk first about this traditional marking gauge that uses a sharp pin to mark the workpiece. To use it, you simply put the fence up against the edge of the workpiece, and then you kind of slightly tilt it back towards you a little bit and drag that pin across the workpiece. As you can see, I'm having a little difficulty controlling it, and we're getting quite a little bit of chip out and tear out here on the cut line, and that's because we're going across the grain. So we're not really cutting a line here as much as we are just scribing and marking, and in the process it's tearing out and popping up that wood grain. So a traditional style marking gauge is probably a little more appropriate for going with the grain. So again, you put the fence up against the edge of the workpiece and make sure you hold it tight against the edge of the workpiece, and then you can just pull back and make a nice line. And you can see how making a line with the grain, along the grain, is much cleaner. There's a problem with that though. What if our grain on our wood is kind of running out like it is on this piece? If we look here, we can see the grain kind of runs in this direction and kind of runs out this edge. So if I use a marking gauge like this, the tendency is that pin is going to want to follow that grain. So sometimes, not always, but sometimes that grain can actually push your marking gauge away from the edge of the workpiece, and now you don't have an accurate line to use for your joinery or whatever it is you're doing with that workpiece. To get around that problem of using a pin that might cause tear out or follow the grain of a workpiece, someone came up with the idea to use an actual cutting edge. In this case, I'm using a wheeled marking gauge that has a cutting edge 360 degrees all the way around. So now if I want to mark across the grain, same principle, I put the fence tight up against the workpiece and just score a line all the way across. If you take a close look at the wheel on this marking gauge, you can see that it has a bevel on it. That bevel serves an important purpose. As you drag the gauge across the wood, that bevel helps to pull the fence of the marking gauge tight against the edge of the workpiece. So when you use a marking gauge with a cutting edge, you always want to make sure that the bevel is facing towards the fence or the head of the marking gauge. Just like the cutting edge on this wheel marking gauge, I have this old marking gauge I made decades ago. It's a little crude and a little rough, but I wanted to point out this blade. This blade is made from an old hacksaw blade. I sharpened one end of it using a shallow arc, and then I beveled that cutting edge. On the opposite end, I formed a point, and then I beveled both sides of that point. So when I install this in my marking gauge, I want to make sure that the bevel is facing the fence or the head of the marking gauge. So the blade on this marking gauge is held in place with a wedge, and the principle is the same. I've got my cutting edge exposed, and the bevel is always facing the fence or the head of the marking gauge. And just like the others, I can drag it across my workpiece to mark a line. And because I've sharpened that blade, it creates a nice clean score line all the way across. And that's a big advantage to using a marking gauge with a cutting edge on it. As you score across the grain, you sever those wood fibers and you leave a nice, clean line. If you're using a marking gauge with a cutting edge on it like this, as we mentioned, the bevel is always facing the fence or the body. You just simply hold the fence tight up against the edge of the workpiece and score a line all the way down or wherever you need to mark for your particular application. Again, the bevel on that cutting wheel helps draw the fence into the workpiece so that I get a nice parallel line. So what if all you have is a traditional style marking gauge with a pin in it? You can modify the shape of that pin using a file and just file the inside of that pin towards the fence or the body of the gauge. Just file the point and create a flat on it. That creates more of a cutting edge than it does a sharp point. So then you get a cleaner line all the way across your workpiece. So if all you have is a traditional marking gauge with a sharp pin in it, you can file the side of that to create more of a cutting edge to get better results. I want to point something out on this panel gauge. If I turn it over and look, you can see that there's a cutting wheel and it is also beveled, and the bevel is facing the fence. So the principle is the same. As you mark your workpiece, that bevel is going to force that fence tight up against the workpiece all the way down so you get a nice accurate line to mark the width of the panel, for example. Another thing I want to point out about a wheel marking gauge, and a question that always comes up, is can you sharpen these wheels? Well, I suppose you could, but it would be difficult and it's really not worth the effort. Instead, you can purchase replacements from the manufacturer and loosen this screw on the end and replace the wheel. Again, on a wheel marking gauge, the blade is not supposed to spin. It's supposed to remain stationary so that it acts like a knife as it cuts through the wood grain. So I hope this helps answer a few questions you may have had about marking gauges and maybe help you decide which ones are more appropriate for your workshop or how to modify the ones you have to get better performance out of them.